The stitches were still throbbing when Raphael threw the papers onto my hospital bed. White papers, cold as ice, contrasting with the red I could still feel pulsing on the side of my body, where there used to be 2 kidneys and now only 1 remained. Just sign this, Elena. I don't have all day. My name is Elena, and at 73 years old I've seen many faces of human cruelty, but nothing prepared me for that moment. I was lying there connected to tubes and monitors, still feeling the anesthesia, dissipating in waves through my body, when the man to whom I had given 22 years of my life, and now a vital piece of my organs, handed me divorce papers with the same casualness of someone delivering an electric bill. You need to understand something about me. I've always been the type who sees beyond appearances. Maybe that's why I survived so much. In that moment, lying in that bed with the fresh scar burning like fire, I saw something in Raphael's eyes that I should have seen much earlier. It wasn't relief at being alive. It was satisfaction. The cold satisfaction of someone who had just executed a perfect plan. Why now? I asked, my voice still hoarse from the breathing tubes. Why right now, Raphael? He didn't even look me in the eyes. He stood there beside the window, contemplating the view as if I were just another piece of furniture in the room. Because now I can, he said simply. Now I have what I need. That's when the puzzle began forming in my mind. All the pieces were there, scattered across the last 6 months. The documents he asked me to sign, to facilitate the medical process, the strange conversations that stopped abruptly when I entered the room, the way his mother Dolores suddenly became so caring during my pre-surgery appointments. I remember the exact moment when everything clicked. It was when I saw that smile, that tiny, almost imperceptible smile that crossed his lips as he watched me read the divorce papers. Not the smile of a man, grateful to be alive, but the smile of someone who had just won a game I didn't even know we were playing. You planned this, I whispered, more to myself than to him. You planned this from the beginning. He turned to me then, and for the first time in months, I saw the real Raphael. Not the desperate husband begging for his life, not the loving man who held my hand during doctor visits, but the calculating stranger who had been wearing my husband's face all along. Elena, he said, his voice now completely different, stripped of any pretense of affection. You always were too smart for your own good. The monitor beside my bed began beeping faster as my heart rate spiked. But it wasn't fear that made my pulse race. It was something else. Something that felt dangerously close to relief. Because finally, I was seeing the truth. As I lay there holding those papers in my trembling hands, I realized something that would change everything. I might have given him my kidney, but I still had my brain. And my brain was already working, already planning, already seeing 3 steps ahead of whatever game he thought he was playing. I looked up at him and for the first time, since the surgery, I smiled. A real smile. You're right, Raphael, I said softly. I am too smart for my own good. That smile seemed to unnerve him more than any tears or screaming could have. He shifted uncomfortably, suddenly uncertain. He couldn't know what I was thinking, couldn't know that in that moment, lying in that hospital bed with his betrayal fresh as my surgical wound, I was already planning something he would never see coming. If you're enjoying my story, don't forget to subscribe to hear how this unfolds, because what happened next would shock even me. The truth is, when you've lived as long as I have, you learn that the most dangerous weapon isn't anger or vengeance. It's patience. And I had just decided to become very, very patient. But first, I needed to understand exactly how deep this betrayal went, because something told me that divorce papers were just the beginning of what Raphael had planned for me. And I was right to be suspicious. The next 3 days in that hospital were like living in a slow-motion nightmare where every detail became crystal clear. You know how sometimes when you're in shock, your mind starts cataloging everything with surgical precision? That's exactly what happened to me. Raphael visited exactly twice. Both times he brought flowers, Cheap carnations from the hospital gift shop, not the orchids I'd grown in our greenhouse for 15 years. Both times he stayed less than 10 minutes, and both times he asked the same question: "Did you sign the papers yet?" I learned something about myself during those visits. I learned that I could lie with the same effortless grace that he'd been lying to me for months. "I'm still too weak to hold a pen properly," I told him, watching his jaw tighten with barely concealed impatience. But it was his mother, Dolores, who revealed just how carefully orchestrated this whole thing had been. She came on the second day, carrying a casserole dish and wearing an expression of practiced concern that I now recognized as performance art. "Oh, mija," she said, settling into the visitor's chair with theatrical exhaustion. "You look so pale. But don't worry, you'll recover quickly. Young women always do." Young women. I was 51. In 22 years of marriage, Dolores had never once called me young. But now, suddenly, I was young enough to bounce back from major surgery, young enough to start over, young enough to disappear quietly. "Dolores," I said carefully, "did Raphael discuss the divorce with you before he brought me those papers?" The woman had been folding and unfolding the same napkin for 30 seconds, but at my question, her hands went completely still. That's when I knew. The silence stretched between us like a taut wire, and I could practically see her calculating how much truth she could afford to reveal. "Elena, sometimes men, they make decisions when they're emotional," she finally said. "The surgery, the stress, it was so... much for him." I almost laughed. Almost. Because Raphael had been many things during those terrible months when kidney failure was slowly killing him, but emotional wasn't one of them. If anything, he'd been unnaturally calm, methodical even. "He seemed very composed when he handed me the papers," I said, my voice steady as bedrock. "Almost like he'd been planning it." Dolores's eyes flicked to the door, then back to me. And in that tiny gesture, I saw the truth she was trying so desperately to hide. They hadn't just discussed the divorce. They'd discussed the timing. They'd sat in her kitchen, drinking her bitter coffee, and planned the exact moment when Raphael would destroy me. After she left, I lay there staring at the ceiling, piecing together a timeline that made my blood run cold. The kidney disease hadn't been sudden. It had been progressing for over a year. Plenty of time to get on transplant lists, to explore other options. But Raphael had refused every suggestion from his doctors about seeking donors outside the family. "I want Elena to do it," he'd insisted, holding my hand in the nephrologist's office. "If anyone's going to save my life, it should be my wife." I'd been so touched by that sentiment, so moved by his faith in me, in us. I'd felt chosen, honored to be his savior. Now I understood the truth. He hadn't chosen me because he loved me. He'd chosen me because I was convenient, because I was already legally bound to him, already living in the same house, already foolish enough to sign whatever papers he put in front of me. The morning before my discharge, a young nurse named Jennifer came to remove my IV. She was chatty, friendly, the kind of person who probably brightened every room she entered. "Your husband seems nice," she said carefully, peeling away the tape. "Though I have to say, most spouses are here a lot more after surgery like this." "Oh." I kept my voice light, curious. "Usually they're practically camping out in the room. My last kidney donor, her sister never left her side for 3 days straight." Jennifer shrugged. "But I guess everyone handles stress differently." "Everyone handles stress differently. Yes, they certainly do. Some people handle stress by grieving, others by worrying, and some, apparently, handle stress by planning their spouse's complete destruction while she recovers from giving them a vital organ." As Jennifer finished with my IV, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to find out exactly how long Raphael had been planning this. I was going to discover who else knew. And then I was going to make sure that every single person who participated in this betrayal understood exactly who they had chosen to cross. Because here's what Raphael didn't know about me. I'd spent my entire career as a forensic accountant. I specialized in finding money that people didn't want found. I could track financial trails through shell companies and offshore accounts like a bloodhound, following a scent. And something told me that this divorce was about much more than just ending our marriage. I went home to an empty house that felt like a crime scene. Every familiar object seemed to mock me. The coffee mug Raphael had drunk from that morning, the newspaper folded to the crossword puzzle he never finished, the framed photo of our wedding day where his smile now looked calculating instead of loving. But I wasn't there to grieve. I was there to hunt. My home office was exactly as I'd left it before the surgery. Files organized, computer password protected, everything in its proper place. Raphael had never shown much interest in my work. Numbers are boring, he'd always said with that charming laugh that I now recognized as dismissal. His mistake. I spent the first hour going through our joint accounts, and what I found made my surgical scar throb with fresh pain. 3 days before my surgery, while I was doing my preoperative fasting, Raphael had transferred $47,000 from our savings account to something called Velez Holdings LLC. I'd never heard of Velez Holdings, but I knew that name. Velez was Dolores's maiden name. My fingers flew across the keyboard as I traced the company registration, filed 6 months ago. Sole proprietor, Dolores Maria Velez. Business address, a P.O. box in downtown Tampa. Business purpose listed as consulting services. Consulting. I almost laughed at the audacity, but that was just the beginning. As I dug deeper, a pattern emerged that made my blood pressure spike. Over the past 8 months, coinciding perfectly with Raphael's kidney disease diagnosis, money had been systematically moved out of our accounts. Small amounts at first, just under the threshold that would require my signature. Then larger. Transfers, always when I was at work or handling his medical appointments. The timing was surgical in its precision. Every transfer happened when I was distracted. Every document was signed when I was emotionally overwhelmed by his condition. They had turned my love for him into a weapon against me. I remember sitting there in my chair, staring at transaction after transaction, and feeling something crack inside my chest. Not my heart breaking, that had already happened in the hospital room. This was something deeper. This was the sound of my last illusion about Raphael shattering completely. You have to understand, I'd built my entire adult life around this man. When I met him at 29, I thought I was getting a partner, someone who would stand beside me through whatever life threw at us. I'd worked 60-hour weeks to put him through graduate school. I'd postponed having children because he wanted to establish his career first. I'd moved across the country twice for his job opportunities, leaving behind friends and the small accounting firm I'd built from nothing. And all the while, apparently, he'd been learning how to steal from me. But the real revelation came when I accessed our business account, the one for my consulting firm. Raphael was listed as a secondary signatory, something I'd added years ago for convenience. Money had been moved from there too. My own earnings, accumulated over decades of work, slowly bled away to fund what I was beginning to understand was my own destruction. Each withdrawal felt like a physical blow. $12,000 in March, $8,500 in April, $15,000 in May. By the time I finished tallying it all up, they'd stolen over $120,000 from me. Money I'd earned by working weekends, by taking cases other accountants wouldn't touch, by building a reputation one satisfied client at a time. The phone rang at exactly 6 p.m. Raphael's voice was clipped, impatient. "Elena, the lawyer needs those papers signed by Friday. Don't make this more complicated than it needs to be." "Which lawyer?" I asked sweetly. "I don't remember discussing legal representation." A pause. "My lawyer, obviously." Obviously. I pulled up another screen on my computer, cross-referencing the checks I'd found. And this lawyer, would his name happen to be Marcus Thornfield? The silence stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. Then Raphael's voice came back, careful now, controlled. How do you know that name? Because 3 weeks ago, while I was getting blood drawn for surgical clearance, someone had written a $5,000 check to Thornfield and Associates from our joint account. The memo line read, "Retainer." "Lucky guess," I said. "Tell me, Raphael, when exactly did you hire a divorce attorney? Before or after I agreed to give you my kidney?" I heard him breathing, heard the calculations spinning in his mind. Finally he said, "Elena, you're upset. You're not thinking clearly. The surgery, the medications." "The surgery was 4 days." "Go," I interrupted. "My mind is perfectly clear, clearer than it's been in months, actually. The beautiful thing about being a forensic accountant is that you develop an instinct for lies. They have a particular texture, a specific weight, and Raphael's voice right then was heavy with deception, thick with the kind of panic that comes when someone realizes their carefully constructed facade is crumbling. "We'll talk when you're feeling better." "No," I said, my voice steady as granite. "We'll talk now, because I have some questions, and I think you're going to want to answer them before I start asking other people." Click. He hung up. I sat back in my chair, staring at the screens full of evidence, and felt something I hadn't experienced in months: control. For the first time since this nightmare began, I wasn't reacting. I was acting. But then I found the insurance policies, hidden. In a subfolder on our shared drive was a document I'd never seen before. A life insurance policy taken out on me just 2 months ago. The beneficiary? Raphael, of course. The amount? $500,000. My hands started shaking as I read the medical questionnaire. Someone had forged my signature, had lied about my health history, had essentially bet $500,000 on my death. The policy was specifically designed to pay out in case of surgical complications or post-operative mortality. That's when I understood the true scope of what they'd planned. This wasn't just, theft. This wasn't just abandonment. They had been hoping I would die on that operating table. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Stop digging, Elena. You won't like what you find." I stared at that message for a long time. Then I screenshot it, saved it to a folder I labeled Evidence, and got back to work. Because here's what they didn't understand. I was a forensic accountant. I didn't just find missing money. I found missing truth. And something told me that my stolen kidney and the divorce papers were just the surface of something much deeper, much darker. As I worked through the night, my surgical wound aching with every movement, I began to understand that I was fighting for more than just my marriage or my money. I was fighting for my life, and I was just getting started. That night I didn't sleep. How could I? Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that insurance policy, those forged signatures, the cold mathematics of my own murder. They had calculated the exact value of my death down to the penny, $500,000, minus whatever they'd already stolen, plus my kidney to save Raphael's life. In their minds, I was worth more dead than alive. But here's what. Raphael never understood about me. I've spent 30 years unraveling financial crimes. I know that the people who think they're the smartest in the room are usually the ones who make the sloppiest mistakes. And Raphael, despite his careful planning, had made several. The first mistake was underestimating me. The second was leaving a paper trail. The third was trusting his mother to keep her mouth shut. I spent the weekend systematically documenting everything. Bank statements, forged signatures, dates, and times of transfers. I photographed every document, saved every digital file to multiple backup drives. I even recorded myself narrating the timeline, creating an audio record that would be harder to dismiss in court. By Sunday evening, I had built a case that would make any prosecutor salivate. But I wasn't ready to involve the authorities yet, because I'd also discovered something else, something that made me realize Raphael and Dolores weren't working alone. The property records showed that our house, the house I'd thought we owned together, had been quietly transferred into a trust 6 months ago. The trustee? Someone named Carmen Ruiz. And Carmen Ruiz. According to my research, was Raphael's ex-girlfriend from college. The same Carmen who had mysteriously reappeared in his life last year, supposedly as a business consultant. I remember the exact moment when I found her LinkedIn profile. There she was, smiling in a professional headshot, listing herself as strategic financial consultant, with a roster of clients that made no sense for someone with her background. Carmen had a degree in art history, not finance. She'd worked as a museum curator for most of her career. Yet somehow in the past 18 months, she'd become a high-powered consultant with an income that afforded her designer clothes and luxury vacations. The photos on her social media told a different story. Expensive restaurants, weekend trips to Napa Valley, jewelry that cost more than most people's cars. And in several photos, barely visible in the background or cropped at the edges, I could make out familiar hands. Hands I'd held for 22 years. Hands that had caressed my face while promising to love me forever. Hands that had signed documents transferring my life savings into Carmen's accounts. Suddenly, Dolores's frequent phone calls made sense. The hushed conversations that stopped when I entered rooms. The way Raphael had become so protective of his phone, so secretive about his schedule. They hadn't just planned to steal from me and abandon me. They'd planned to erase me entirely and start fresh with Carmen. I found text message records that made my surgical wound burn with fresh pain. Raphael writing to Carmen just 2 days after my surgery. Phase 1 complete. Elena still doesn't suspect anything. We'll have everything transferred by next month. Carmen's response. Can't wait to start our real life together, baby. This house is perfect for us. Our real life. As if the 22 years I'd given him were just some elaborate rehearsal for the authentic relationship he planned with her. My surgical scar throbbed as I paced my empty house, but the pain felt different now. Sharper. Cleaner. It was the pain of clarity, of purpose crystallizing in my chest like ice forming on water. That's when I made the call that would change everything. Davidson Investigations, a gravelly voice answered. Jack speaking. Jack Davidson was a private investigator I'd worked with on several embezzlement cases. He was expensive, discreet, and had the kind of moral flexibility that made him very effective at finding information that people wanted to keep hidden. Jack, it's Elena Restrepo. I need your help. Elena, haven't heard from you in, 2 years? How's married life treating you? I almost laughed at the irony. That's actually why I'm calling. I need a full background workup on my husband, and his girlfriend, and his mother. Financial records, phone records, travel history, the works. There was a pause. Jack was sharp enough to read between the lines. This sounds personal. It's about to get very personal. My retainer is $10,000. I'll wire you 15. I need this done fast and I need it done thoroughly. Consider it done. Elena, you okay? You sound different. I looked at my reflection in the darkened window, pale, thin, but with something new in my eyes. Something that hadn't been there a week ago. I'm becoming someone new, Jack. Someone they're not going to like very much. While Jack worked his magic, I focused on the immediate problem. Those divorce papers sitting unsigned on my kitchen table. Raphael was getting impatient. His daily phone calls had become increasingly aggressive, his threats barely veiled. But I had no intention of signing anything until I understood the full scope of their betrayal. I also started making my own calls. To banks, asking about account access and fund recovery procedures. To insurance companies, inquiring about fraudulent policies. To the medical board, asking about protocols when patients might be endangered by family members. Each conversation was a small piece of ammunition, carefully gathered and catalogued. The most interesting call was to Dr. Martinez, the nephrologist who had coordinated our transplant. I told him I was having some post-surgical anxiety and wanted to review the medical timeline. Mrs. Restrepo, your husband was actually eligible for several donor programs, he said, reviewing Raphael's file. There were other options we discussed, but he was quite insistent that he wanted you as the donor. Other options? The paired kidney exchange program for one. We had 3 potential matches that would have allowed you to keep both your kidneys while still saving his life. But Mr. Restrepo said you'd specifically requested to be the direct donor. I sat in stunned silence, processing this information. Raphael had lied to me about that too. There had been other ways to save his life, ways that wouldn't have required me to sacrifice my own organ. But those ways wouldn't have served his larger plan. He'd needed me weakened, hospitalized, vulnerable. He'd needed me to feel like his savior, like someone who'd made the ultimate sacrifice. It made the betrayal more complete, more devastating, and it gave him cover. What kind of man would abandon the woman who'd literally given him life? The kind of man who'd been planning to kill her for the insurance money. If the surgery went wrong, 3 days later Jack called back. "Elena, you sitting down, because what I found is going to knock you flat." He'd discovered that Carmen Ruiz owned not just 1 property, but 3, all purchased in the last 18 months with cash, all in neighborhoods that Carmen, working as a part-time consultant, should never have been able to afford. But the real bombshell was the phone records. Raphael and Carmen had been in contact for over a year, daily calls, sometimes lasting hours. And the timing of their communication correlated perfectly with Raphael's medical appointments, his insurance applications, and every major financial transfer from our accounts. "There's more," Jack continued. "Your husband took out loans against his future inheritance. His mother co-signed for them. We're talking about serious money here, Elena. Close to $300,000. Loans for what? Investment opportunities, according to the paperwork. But I traced where the money actually went. Want to guess?" I already knew. "Carmen. Bingo. She's been playing the stock market with your husband's borrowed money. And she's been losing, big time. Those properties I mentioned, they're all leveraged to the hilt. She owes more on them than they're worth." The picture was becoming clearer, and it was uglier than I'd imagined. This wasn't just about starting fresh with Carmen. It was about covering massive financial losses. They needed my money to dig themselves out of the hole they'd created, and they'd been willing to kill me to get it. But Jack wasn't finished. "Elena, there's something else. Something that's going to make you very angry. More angry than I already am? Your husband has been seeing a psychiatrist. Dr. Rebecca Torres, he's been claiming that you've been exhibiting signs of mental instability, that you've been making threats against him and his family." My blood went cold. "What kind of threats?" "According to his testimony, you've been saying things like, 'You'll pay for this, and I'll make sure everyone knows what you really are.' He's been building a case that you're mentally unfit, potentially dangerous. Elena, I think he's planning to have you committed." The room spun around me. It was brilliant, in a sick way. If I started making accusations about fraud and attempted murder, Raphael already had documentation that I was delusional, unstable, possibly suicidal after my surgery. Who would believe the mentally ill ex-wife over the grieving husband who'd been driven to desperate measures by her threats? 300,000, plus what they'd already stolen from me, plus the life insurance payout they'd been counting on. They hadn't just planned my destruction, they'd borrowed against it. That evening, I sat in my kitchen with all the evidence spread across the table like tarot cards revealing an ugly future. But I wasn't the victim in this story anymore. I was the author, and I was about to rewrite the ending. You know what they say about revenge being a dish best served cold? They're wrong. Revenge is best served precisely, methodically, with the kind of attention to detail that ensures your enemies never see it coming until it's too late to stop it. The beautiful thing about being underestimated is that people stop watching for your moves. Raphael thought he was playing chess while I was playing checkers. He had no idea that I'd been playing chess my entire career, and I was about 10 moves ahead of where he thought I was. If you're wondering how this story ends, stay with me, because what I did next will restore your faith that justice still exists in this world, even when the system fails us. I picked up my phone and dialed Raphael's number. When he answered, his voice was tight with barely controlled anger. "Elena, Those papers better be signed, or what? I interrupted quietly. Or, you'll forge my signature like you did on the insurance policy? The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear his breathing change, could practically feel his panic through the phone line. That's when I knew I had him exactly where I wanted him. I don't know what you're talking about. Of course you don't. Just like you don't know about the $300,000 in loans or Carmen's real estate investments or Dr. Torres's very interesting psychological evaluation. Should I keep going? And I was just getting started. The sound of Raphael dropping his phone was audible even through the connection. When he picked it up again, his voice was shaking. Elena, listen to me. You're confused. The surgery, the medications, they can affect your thinking. Dr. Torres explained this might happen. Did she now? I smiled in my empty kitchen, surrounded by evidence of his betrayal. Funny thing about Dr. Torres, I called her office today. Imagine my surprise when I learned that you've been paying her directly, not through insurance. Cash payments, Raphael. Very generous ones. The silence stretched between us like a taut wire ready to snap. You've been documenting my supposed mental instability for months, haven't you? Building a case that I'm delusional, possibly dangerous. Very clever. If I start accusing you of attempted murder and fraud, you already have professional testimony that I'm not mentally competent. Elena, but here's where you made a mistake, I continued, my voice steady as bedrock. Dr. Torres is required by law to report threats of violence, yet there's no record of any such report in the system. I checked. Which means either you never actually made those threats against me, or Dr. Torres is committing fraud by taking payments for false testimony. I heard him breathing heavily, heard the sound of footsteps. He was pacing, probably pulling at his hair the way he always did when cornered. You think you've been so clever, don't you, Raphael? Marrying the quiet little accountant, making her fall in love with you, convincing her to work herself to death to pay for your dreams, and then, when you got bored, finding a way to take everything she'd built and disappear with your college girlfriend. It's not like that. No? Then tell me, when exactly did you reconnect with Carmen? Before or after your kidney diagnosis? Another silence. I could practically hear his mind racing, trying to calculate how much I knew versus how much I was guessing. I have phone records, Raphael. 14 months of daily contact with Carmen. Your kidney disease was diagnosed 13 months ago. Do you see the problem with your timeline? That's when I heard her voice in the background, Carmen, asking who was on the phone. So they were together. Of course they were. Probably in the house that used to be mine, planning their future with my money. Put me on speaker, I said. Elena, don't do this. Put me on speaker. Raphael. A click, and suddenly I could hear them both clearly. Carmen's voice came through, trying to sound concerned. Elena, honey, are you okay? Raphael's been so worried about you. I almost admired the performance. Almost. Hello, Carmen. Or should I say, hello to my money. I hope you're enjoying the 3 properties you bought with it. A sharp intake of breath. I don't know what you're talking about. Maple Street, Coral Gables, Oak Avenue, Kendall, and that lovely little condo in South Beach, all purchased with cash that originated from my accounts. My investigator has the, paper trail, sweetie. Every single transaction. The sound that came through the phone might have been a sob or a gasp. With Carmen, it was hard to tell what was real and what was performance. But I wasn't finished. Raphael, are you still there? Because I have something else I want to share with both of you. Something I discovered today that made everything finally make sense. Elena, please. Your kidney disease wasn't progressive, was it? It was acute, caused by deliberate nephrotoxic poisoning over several months. The silence that followed was so complete I thought they'd hung up. Then Raphael's voice, barely a whisper. You can't prove that. Can't I? I had Jack run a trace on your internet search history. Very interesting reading, Raphael. Undetectable kidney damage. Substances that cause renal failure. How long before kidney disease becomes fatal? Should I go on? You have to understand, This was the moment when everything crystallized for me. Sitting in my kitchen holding all the pieces of their conspiracy, I realized that Raphael hadn't just betrayed our marriage. He'd poisoned himself, deliberately destroyed his own kidneys to create a medical crisis that would force me to donate mine. And if the surgery had gone wrong, if I'd died on that table, he would have collected $500,000 and played the grieving widower while starting fresh with Carmen and my life savings. It was brilliant, absolutely brilliant, and absolutely evil. The beautiful irony, I continued, my voice growing stronger with each word, is that you destroyed your kidneys for nothing, because while you were poisoning yourself and planning my murder, I was planning something too. What are you talking about? I smiled, thinking about the papers I'd filed that morning, the federal fraud investigation I'd initiated, the forensic accounting team that was already freezing assets, the criminal attorney who would be calling the FBI within the hour. I'm talking about the fact that as of this morning, every account, every property, every asset that you've stolen from me has been frozen pending a federal investigation. Carmen's properties are under seizure order. Your mother's little LLC is being audited by the IRS. And that insurance policy you forged? The FBI's white-collar crime unit is very interested in that. The sound that came through the phone was like an animal in pain. Raphael, realizing that his perfect plan had just collapsed around him. But, Elena, I said, my voice soft now, almost gentle, I saved the best for last. I pulled up the document I'd been working on all week, my own insurance policy, taken out years ago and recently updated with a very specific beneficiary designation. Remember how you convinced me to sign all those medical forms before surgery? How you told me they were just standard paperwork? Well, it turns out that one of those forms was actually an authorization to record all surgical procedures. For medical training purposes. I paused, letting that sink in. The recording exists, Raphael. Audio and video of you in that recovery room, explaining to your mother exactly how clever you'd been, how you'd poisoned yourself, manipulated me into donating my kidney, and planned to either collect insurance money from my death or divorce me once you recovered. The sound of something crashing, maybe a glass, maybe a whole table, came through the phone. The recording is already in the hands of the FBI, the medical board, and my attorney. It's also going to be played at your criminal trial. All of your trials, actually. Because between the fraud, the forgery, the attempted murder, and the conspiracy charges, you're looking at about 40 years in federal prison. That's when I heard Carmen screaming at Raphael, heard Dolores's voice joining the chaos, heard the sound of 3 people's lives imploding in real time. But I wasn't finished, because I'd learned something about myself during this whole nightmare. I wasn't just Elena the victim anymore. I was Elena the survivor, Elena the fighter, Elena the woman who'd been underestimated for the last time. And I had one final surprise. For them, Elena, Raphael's voice was barely a whisper now. What else do you have? I closed my eyes and thought about that moment in the hospital room when he'd thrown those divorce papers at me. How small I'd felt, how broken, how I'd believed, even for a moment, that maybe I deserved it. The kidney you're living with right now, Raphael, the one that's keeping you alive, it's not going to be yours much longer. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear my own heartbeat. What do you mean? Carmen's voice, sharp with panic. I mean that when you poison yourself to fake a medical crisis, when you manipulate someone into donating an organ under false pretenses, that organ can be legally reclaimed. It's called donation under duress and fraud, and there's precedent for it. I wasn't lying. I'd spent 2 days consulting with medical lawyers, ethics, boards, and transplant specialists. The case was unprecedented but legally sound. You're bluffing, Raphael said, but I could hear the terror in his voice. Am I? Tell me, how are you feeling lately, Raphael? Any nausea, fatigue, sharp pains in your side? I paused, letting him process what I was implying. Because according to my medical consultants, the psychological stress of pending criminal charges can trigger organ rejection. And once rejection starts, I didn't need to finish. He knew what happened to people who lost transplanted kidneys. The sound of retching came through the key phone. Raphael, physically sick with the realization of what he'd done to himself. But Elena, I continued, my voice steady and calm, I want you to know that I'm not a monster. I'm not going to let you die, even after everything you've done to me. Hope crept into his voice. You mean, that I've arranged for you to have the absolute best medical care during your incarceration. The federal prison medical system has excellent dialysis facilities. You'll be well taken care of while you serve your sentence. The wailing that erupted from the phone was Carmen, finally understanding that her comfortable future had just evaporated. All those properties, all that stolen money, all their careful plans, reduced to nothing. But I had one more thing to say. Raphael, do you remember what you told me that day in the hospital, when you handed me those divorce papers? Silence. You said, now I have what I need. Well, guess what? Now I have what I need too. I hung up the phone and sat back in my chair, surrounded by evidence of their crimes, and felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Peace. Not the satisfaction of revenge. That had worn off quickly. But the deep, bone-deep peace that comes from knowing you've fought for yourself and won. The next 6 months were a whirlwind of legal proceedings, testimony, and media attention. Raphael, Carmen, and Dolores were all indicted on multiple federal charges. The story became national news. The husband who poisoned himself to steal his wife's kidney and life savings. Raphael never made it to trial. 3 months after our phone call, his kidney began failing, not from medical rejection, but from the same stress and guilt that had driven him to poison himself in the first place. He died in federal custody, finally a victim of his own evil instead of mine. Carmen got 12 years for fraud and conspiracy. Dolores got 8. All the stolen assets were recovered and returned to me, plus damages. But you want to know the real victory? It wasn't the money or the justice or even Raphael's death. It was what happened after. I used the recovered funds to start a foundation, the Elena Restrepo Center for Victim Advocacy. We help people who've been financially abused by family members, who've been manipulated and gaslit, and made to feel like they're losing their minds. Because here's what I learned during those dark months. There are thousands of people out there living with their own Raphaels, spouses who steal their retirement funds, children who manipulate elderly parents, partners who systematically destroy their loved ones' lives for personal gain. And most of them never fight back because they don't know how, or they don't think they deserve better, or they're too ashamed to admit they've been fooled. I meet with these people now in my office that overlooks Tampa Bay. I look them in the eyes and I tell them what I wish someone had told me. You are not stupid for trusting someone you loved. You are not weak for believing in their promises. You are not responsible for their choice to betray you. And then I help them fight back. Last month, I helped a 70-year-old woman recover $200,000 that her son had stolen from her Social Security account. 2 weeks ago, I assisted a young mother in documenting financial abuse that helped her escape her marriage with her children and her dignity intact. This morning, I received a letter from a man whose brother had been systematically stealing from their father's estate. Thanks to our intervention, the father's assets were protected, and the brother is facing criminal charges. Each case is different, but the story is always the same. Someone trusted, someone betrayed that trust, and someone else convinced them they had the power to fight back. My surgical scar has faded to a thin white line, barely visible now. But I touch it sometimes when I'm working late or meeting with a particularly difficult case. And I remember that night in the hospital when Raphael threw those papers at me. I remember how small I felt, how powerless, how I thought my life was ending. I was wrong. That was the night my real life began. You see, when someone tries to destroy you, when they take everything they can take and leave you with nothing, they make a critical mistake. They assume that having nothing means you have nothing to lose. But having nothing to lose is the most dangerous position of all, because it means you're free to become whoever you need to become to survive. I'm 73 years old now. I live in a modest apartment, drive a sensible car, and spend my days helping other people reclaim their lives from the predators who would destroy them. I have never been happier. My name is Elena, and I learned that the human spirit is far more resilient than our enemies imagine. Sometimes the very people who try to break us end up making us stronger than we ever dreamed possible. If my story has taught you anything, let it be this. No matter how powerless you feel, no matter how completely someone has betrayed your trust, you always have more strength than you know. The question isn't whether you can fight back, it's whether you will. Choose to fight. Choose to survive. Choose to become the person your enemies never saw coming, because you are more powerful than they will ever understand.